In a quiet private meeting, Elon Musk leaned forward and asked Jonathan Roumie one haunting question. Would Jesus think? I've missed the point. No cameras, no crowd, just a painting, a dream, and a conversation that shook them both. And then Elon whispered, "He didn't speak, he just looked at me." And everything changed. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Jonathan Roumie stepped into the quiet, glass-walled meeting room with a touch of hesitation. The late afternoon sun poured in through tall windows, casting long beams across the sleek wooden floor. Elon Musk was already there, standing near the corner, sipping coffee. He turned as Jonathan entered and walked over with an extended hand and a faint smile. "Jonathan, thank you for coming," Elon said, his tone softer than expected. "It's my pleasure, Mr. Musk," Jonathan replied, meeting his gaze. "Please, call me Elon." There were no cameras, no staff, just two chairs, a small table between them, and a pair of untouched coffee mugs. As they sat down, Jonathan braced for the typical conversation. Questions about the chosen, about playing Jesus, maybe a compliment or two before getting down to business. But Elon surprised him. "I've watched your portrayal," Elon began, picking up his mug. "It's different than what I expected. More human, more real." Jonathan nodded quietly, unsure where the conversation was heading. Then Elon leaned in, his expression shifting. "I've spent my whole life thinking in terms of systems, solar panels, rockets, algorithms. But lately, I keep circling back to something I can't quantify." He paused, lowering his voice. "I want to know what Jesus would think of my work." Elon stared into his coffee for a long moment before speaking again. "I've been watching your series, The Chosen," he said slowly, his voice tinged with reflection. "And I've been reading more than I ever expected to about Jesus. Not from a religious angle at first, just trying to understand the man." Jonathan listened, silently taking in the surprising vulnerability. Elon continued, "The last few months have felt different. I've been announcing breakthroughs, solar tech that could change the world, software updates that redefine automation. But something's missing. There's this sense of emptiness." He looked up, his eyes steady. "It's strange to feel hollow when everything is working." Jonathan nodded gently, but stayed quiet. "I look at the things I've built, Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and I ask myself, does any of it matter if the people we're building for are more disconnected, more lonely, more spiritually lost?" Elon shook his head slightly. "I've always believed in progress. But progress toward what?" He leaned back, searching the ceiling like he was asking a question no machine could answer. "And here's the thing that keeps me up at night," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Does any of it matter if love isn't at the center?" Elon folded his hands, pausing before speaking again. "Most of my life has been defined by reason. Science, logic, physics. They were the pillars I leaned on. When something didn't make sense, I ran simulations. When I hit a wall, I built something to climb over it. I believed that with enough data, every question could be answered." Jonathan listened intently, sensing that Elon was opening a door most people never got to see behind. "But something changed," Elon continued. "I can't pinpoint when exactly. Maybe it was the long nights alone in my lab. Maybe it was the quiet moments after launching a rocket into orbit when I should have felt triumphant but instead felt small." He exhaled deeply. "I began having these dreams. Not nightmares, more like questions wrapped in silence. I'd wake up unsettled, not because of what I saw, but because of what I couldn't explain. Dreams of empty cities, towers with no doors, lights with no people." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. Calm night, Elon said softly. I woke up with a phrase burning in my mind. What if you've built towers without meaning? He looked away. It shook me. I've spent decades building structures that reach further, dig deeper, move faster. But what if they're hollow at the core? Jonathan said nothing, letting the moment breathe. That's when I started painting, Elon added, almost embarrassed. It wasn't planned, I just needed a way to explore questions that didn't belong on a whiteboard. Things like beauty, sorrow, longing. Things that couldn't be measured in code. He turned back, meeting Jonathan's gaze with unguarded sincerity. And somewhere between brushstrokes and silence, I realized I wasn't just asking scientific questions anymore. I was searching for something eternal, something that wouldn't fade once the launch ended. He paused. That's what brought me to this conversation. Jonathan took a sip of his coffee and leaned forward. When I first agreed to play Jesus, I thought it would be about lines and posture, getting the technical aspects right. But it wasn't long before it became something deeper. You can't portray someone like him without being changed. I started reading scripture not as a script, but as something alive. I began seeing people differently. Elon tilted his head. Differently how? With more patience, Jonathan answered. More curiosity, more compassion. Jesus wasn't just kind, he was deeply intentional. He didn't move fast just because he could. He moved toward people, especially the ones everyone else ignored. That's what struck me most. His eyes were always on the one. Elon nodded slowly. I admire that. I've always admired him, even if I didn't understand him. But I struggle with knowing if that kind of compassion is compatible with the scale of work I'm doing. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I build systems, infrastructure, technologies that affect billions of people, and I believe they're needed, essential even. But I'm starting to question whether I've confused impact with meaning. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. You mean, are you helping people or just pushing the boundaries of what's possible? Exactly, Elon said, his voice tight. It's not that I want to stop, but when I think about Jesus, his focus, his values, I wonder if I've missed something essential. Jonathan rested his elbows on the table. Jesus never condemned progress, but he did challenge priorities. He asked what we treasure, where our hearts are, and maybe most importantly, who we're willing to notice. Elon looked down, his hands fidgeting slightly. Sometimes I look at everything I've built, and it feels like a monument to movement. Constant acceleration. But what's it all for? If the world we create doesn't heal people, doesn't remind them they matter? That's a powerful question, Jonathan said, and I think it's the right one. I'm not afraid of building, Elon added, but I'm afraid of building the wrong things for the wrong reasons, of missing the point. Jonathan sat quietly for a moment before responding. There's a line Jesus said that I think about often. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? He wasn't condemning achievement. He was pointing to the danger of forgetting why we pursue it in the first place. Elon looked up sharply. That's the line that started all of this for me. I read it one night in the Gospel of Mark. I'd just signed a major deal, something that would push one of my projects forward by years. But I couldn't sleep. That verse kept echoing in my mind. It was like someone was asking me directly. Jonathan leaned back. Then maybe that's where the conversation needs to start. Not with what you've built, but with who you're becoming. Elon looked away for a moment, then back again. Do you think Jesus would see what I'm doing and say I missed the point? Jonathan was quiet, weighing the question. But before he could answer, Elon continued, his voice lower. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just building modern towers of Babel, structures that stretch toward the heavens but lead nowhere. The words hung heavy in the room. Jonathan didn't rush to respond. Both men sat in the silence, feeling the weight of the moment, aware that the real conversation, the one underneath the surface, was just beginning. Elon walked toward a side door in the room and motioned for Jonathan to follow. "There's something I want to show you," he said quietly. "I haven't shared this with many people." They moved down a quiet hallway, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft carpet. Elon unlocked a door and pushed it open, revealing a large space that looked nothing like a tech lab. Instead, it was an art studio, dimly lit, quiet, and filled with canvases of varying sizes. Paintings leaned against the walls and stood on easels. Some were dark, stormy in tone, while others radiated light and warmth. Jonathan stepped inside slowly, his eyes scanning the room. "You did all of these?" Elon nodded. "I started painting during a time when words weren't enough, when data and spreadsheets couldn't explain what I was feeling." He paused, then added, "It began after a dream I had, one that hasn't let go of me since." He moved toward a large canvas near the back. "In the dream, I was sitting on a bench with Jesus. We were overlooking a vast city. It wasn't clear where we were exactly. It felt high up, like the edge of a mountain or a rooftop, but we could see everything." Jonathan stepped closer. The painting Elon had stopped beside showed two figures, one modern, one robed, seated side by side, silhouetted against a glowing skyline. The faces weren't detailed, but the posture spoke volumes. One leaned forward in search, the other sat steady, open, present. "I don't remember his words," Elon continued, eyes fixed on the canvas, "but I remember the feeling. There was no judgment, no pressure, just presence, peace. Like all the noise of my life had fallen silent in that moment." Jonathan studied the brushstrokes, the way light and shadow danced across the canvas. "What did you take away from it?" Elon walked to a second painting, darker in palette. Deep blues and purples, specks of gold like scattered stars. "After that dream, I started painting what I couldn't verbalize. The confusion, the longing, the fear that maybe I've done everything right and still missed the point." Jonathan turned to him. "Missed what point?" He gestured to the next canvas. "Rockets, AI, tunnels. I've forgotten the individuals. I've forgotten the people." He gestured to the next canvas, one with countless tiny glowing dots stretching across a night cityscape. In the dream, Jesus looked at the lights and said, "I see people who need to know they matter." Elon's voice faltered slightly. "Not that they're part of a system, not that they're consumers or data points, just people. Each one important, each one seen." Jonathan was silent, moved by both the imagery and Elon's words. It wasn't just admiration. It was a man coming to terms with the magnitude of his own life's work and wondering if it had missed something essential. "Do you think that's true?" Elon asked suddenly. "Do you think God cares about each person that specifically, even in the middle of billions?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "From everything I've studied, everything I've prayed, yes, that's exactly what I believe. That he doesn't just care about humanity in the abstract. He cares about your neighbor, your child, the janitor in your building, the lonely engineer on your team." Elon stared at the painting again. "Then I've been thinking too small in the wrong way. I've been trying to expand humanity's reach without expanding our compassion." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then his voice softened again, almost like a whisper. He pointed to the lights and said, "I see people who need to know they matter." The room was still. Jonathan took a slow breath, sensing that beneath Elon's intellect, his ambition, and all the technological mastery was a heart searching not just for truth, but for love that could hold it. Elon stood in front of the canvas for a long moment, his eyes tracing the brush strokes of his own hand, then slowly turned back to Jonathan. There was no trace of the familiar bravado that often marked his public persona. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, almost uncertain. "I think I'm scared," he said simply. "Not of failure in the usual sense. I've made peace with risk, with loss. But I'm scared that none of it will matter, that I'll look back at everything I've built and realize I built the wrong thing." Jonathan didn't move, sensing that this was a moment for listening, not rescuing. "I'm scared I've become a symbol more than a person," Elon continued. "That people see me as this machine of progress, an inventor, a problem solver, but inside, I don't know if I've ever really figured out who I am without the next launch or the next breakthrough." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He flipped to a page, then read aloud. "If consciousness is the universe's way of understanding itself, then love must be consciousness's way of fulfilling itself." He looked up at Jonathan. "That line came to me one night. I didn't write it down because I was proud of it. I wrote it because it scared me. Because I realized I'd been chasing understanding, but I didn't know what fulfillment actually looked like." Jonathan leaned forward, folding his hands. "You're not alone in that fear, Elon. I think every person who slows down long enough to ask the real questions faces that same silence, that same ache. But Jesus had a way of flipping the definitions. He didn't measure greatness the way the world does." "How did he measure it?" Elon asked quietly. "By love," Jonathan answered. "Not love as sentiment, but love as action, as sacrifice, as choosing people over power. He never condemned people for building or creating. He just asked them to examine why." Elon closed the notebook slowly. "So, if everything I build is ultimately rooted in fear, in ego, in legacy, it misses the point." "Maybe not entirely," Jonathan said, "but it needs something more. Love is what transforms action into purpose. It's what makes legacy something more than memory. It makes it sacred." There was a long silence between them. Then Elon spoke again, more vulnerable than he had all afternoon. "I've been asking myself, if I walk away from all of this tomorrow, would I still matter? Not to the world, but to anyone who truly knows me?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "That's a holy question." Elon stepped back from the painting and ran a hand through his hair. "I've spent years thinking in terms of systems, supply chains, launch windows, timelines. But now I wonder if all those systems have distracted me from something deeper." He looked directly at Jonathan. "How do I live like that? How do I measure by love, by relationship, and still build, still innovate, still lead at scale?" Jonathan took a breath, feeling the weight of Elon's question. The moment stretched, thick with meaning, poised on the edge of revelation. Elon didn't flinch from the question. He leaned forward slightly, voice barely above a whisper. "How do I live like that and still build?" Jonathan leaned forward, his tone thoughtful but steady. "Elon, you don't have to stop building. Jesus never asked people to stop being who they were. He didn't ask Peter to stop fishing. He told him to become a fisher of men. He didn't tell the centurion to leave his post. He praised his faith right where he stood." Elon's brow furrowed as he absorbed the words. "So it's not about abandoning innovation?" "No," Jonathan said gently. "It's about redirecting it, taking the gifts you've been given, your vision, your influence, your ability to shape the future, and using them in service of something higher than progress for progress' sake. Jesus called people not to erase who they were, but to awaken to why they were made." Elon looked down at the notebook in his hand. "Maybe I've been trying to fill a spiritual void with intellectual achievement." Jonathan nodded. "A lot of people do. But you're asking the right questions now. You're not running from them, you're facing them. That's where wisdom begins." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Elon exhaled and looked back at one of his paintings, a canvas showing a tree growing out of an old, rusted machine. "Maybe I wasn't off track," he said slowly. "Maybe I was just off target." Jonathan smiled. "That's not failure, that's discovery." A light seemed to shift in Elon's expression. "I've spent so much time thinking about how to preserve human consciousness. But what if the real task is preserving human dignity? What if AI, neural networks, all of it, what if it can be shaped to reflect not just our intelligence, but our compassion?" "This," Jonathan said, "is exactly the question Jesus would want you to ask." Elon's voice was quiet but clear. A world where machines don't replace people, but elevate the most human parts of us. A world where progress isn't about dominance, but service. Where we develop not to control, but to care. Jonathan nodded again, this time with conviction. Jesus didn't come to establish a religion. He came to restore a relationship. With God, with each other, with the purpose we were created for. And maybe, Elon said slowly, technology is just a canvas. Maybe I've been painting the wrong picture, but now I see what it's supposed to become. He didn't smile, but there was light in his eyes now. And for the first time, it wasn't just about the future of humanity. It was about the heart behind it. The room fell quiet as Elon stood back from the final painting, the one that had haunted him for weeks. The canvas showed two figures seated side by side, one in modern clothes, the other draped in robes, their faces cast in warm shadow, framed by a distant sunrise. Elon reached out and gently straightened the frame, then stepped away. Jonathan watched him carefully, the silence between them filled with something unspoken yet deeply understood. "I've always believed innovation was my calling," Elon said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "But I see now that purpose isn't just about creating. It's about how and why we create. I don't want to build things that simply last. I want to build things that love." He turned to Jonathan with quiet conviction. "If I'm going to lead others forward, I have to start here," he said, pressing a hand lightly to his chest. "It's not enough to align missions or messaging. I need to align my own heart with something bigger than me." Jonathan nodded, walking slowly toward a painting filled with rich reds and golds. He placed his palm gently on its surface. "This," he said, "is prayer with color." Elon blinked, surprised by the description. Then, for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Not the smile of a public figure or a calculated reply, but something more vulnerable. "Maybe this whole time," he said, "I was praying with code." There was no audience to witness this moment. No applause, no breaking news, just two men standing in a studio full of questions, memories, and brushstrokes of something deeper than either had fully anticipated. As the meeting drew to a close, Elon carried the painting of the bench, of himself and Jesus, to a corner of the studio. He paused, looking at it one last time. Then, without a word, he walked it down the hall and hung it quietly in his personal office, just across from the desk where he made the world's biggest decisions. No press release, no announcement, just a reminder of who was with him and what mattered most. This wasn't a conversion, it was a convergence, a meeting of worlds that most never expect to overlap: science and faith, reason and wonder, silicon and spirit. Elon Musk didn't abandon the mission he's always carried. He didn't step away from the future. Instead, he allowed something ancient and eternal to step into it. The dream that once felt distant now lives in the way he codes, designs, builds, and relates. Sitting across from Jonathan Roumie, he didn't claim to have found all the answers, but he found the thread running through every question. Love, not just as a feeling, but as a foundation, not just as an ideal, but as a guide. I still build rockets, Elon said, but now I build them with love. He didn't walk away from the stars. He simply saw them differently, from the perspective of a God who not only created galaxies, but also sees the heart of every soul staring up at them. So what will you build with your words, your work, your witness? If this inspiring story moved you, share it. Let every breakthrough serve something deeper. Let your light shine, boldly, wisely, and with love that outlasts every invention, because truth without love fades. But love endures.